Welcome back to Sacred Arc, a podcast about life, loss, and the soul in between. I'm Kimberly, intuitive grief guide, death doula, licensed esthetician, and whether I wanted to be or not, a lifelong student of grief. Over the course of this season, we've walked through some very complex terrain together. We've talked about childhood environments and the ways those early years shape us long after we leave them. We talked about complicated parents and how love and pain can exist in the same relationship. We talked about silence as survival and how many people learned that being quiet was sometimes the safest option available to them. We talked about the roles people learn to carry, becoming the strong one, the caretaker, the peacekeeper. We talked about how those early patterns show up later in life in our relationships, in our boundaries, in the ways we struggle to trust again after harm. And underneath all of those conversations, there's a quiet theme that runs through almost every survival story. Many of us learn to be incredibly hard on ourselves. We learn to second-guess our reactions, to question our instincts, to believe that if we had just been stronger, calmer, more patient, less emotional, maybe things would have been different. Maybe the conflict wouldn't have happened. Maybe the person wouldn't have left. Maybe the relationship would have worked. Maybe the pain could have been avoided. And over time, those thoughts turn into something heavier. Self-blame, not just for what happened to us, but how we survived it. So today, as we close out this season, I want to talk about something that can feel surprisingly difficult for people who grew up navigating complicated environments. Self-compassion, what it actually means, why it can feel uncomfortable and even unfamiliar at first, and why learning to extend compassion toward ourselves is often one of the most important steps in healing. For many people, compassion toward others comes naturally. If a friend tells you about something painful they went through, you probably don't immediately start criticizing them. You don't usually say things like, well, I guess you should have known better, or maybe you should have handled that differently or seen that one coming. Instead, most of us instinctively respond with empathy. We try to understand the circumstances. We recognize that people do the best they can with the situation they're in. We see their humanity. But when we look at our own lives, something shifts. We become harsher, more critical, more analytical. We replay conversations in our minds. We revisit decisions. We wonder if we should have said something different, left sooner, trusted less, trusted more. And the truth is, many of us were taught to think this way. Not necessarily because anyone sat us down and told us to blame ourselves, but because the environments we grew up in required a certain level of hyper-awareness. Children in unpredictable environments often develop a strong sense of responsibility for the emotional climate around them. They learn to monitor tone, mood, energy. They learn to ask themselves, what did I do wrong? What can I do to make this better? Or what do I need to change so things calm down? And when that pattern develops early enough, it becomes automatic. Self-criticism starts to feel like responsibility, but they're not the same thing. Self-criticism keeps you trapped in the past, but self-compassion helps you understand it. Throughout this season, we've talked about how children are incredibly adaptive. They are constantly studying their environment, even when they don't realize they're doing it. They learn very quickly what behaviors lead to safety and what behaviors lead to conflict. They learn what earns approval, what earns affection, what earns silence. Some children become quiet observers. They learn to stay small, to avoid drawing attention, to keep their thoughts to themselves. Other children become caretakers. They try to stabilize the emotional world around them. They soothe others. They manage tensions. They take on responsibilities that were never meant for them. And some children become the strong one, the one who doesn't ask for help, the one who seems independent early, the one who appears to handle things without needing much support. None of these roles develop randomly. They develop because the child's nervous system is doing something incredibly intelligent. It's trying to survive. And when those strategies work, even temporarily, they become ingrained. They become part of how that child moves through the world. But years later, when that child becomes an adult, they often look back at those behaviors with judgment instead of understanding. They ask themselves questions like, why didn't I speak up? Why did I stay quiet? Why did I tolerate things I shouldn't have tolerated? Or why didn't I leave sooner? But those questions overlook something essential. The version of you who lived through those moments was responding to the reality they were in. And often that reality included limited power, limited information, and limited safety. Survival strategies are not signs of weakness, they're signs of intelligence. One of the unexpected things that happens when people begin practicing self-compassion is the grief that often shows up. Because when we stop criticizing our younger selves and start looking at them with kindness, we begin to see their circumstances more clearly. We start to notice things we once overlooked, the responsibilities we carried before we were ready, the emotional roles we stepped into before we even had language for what we were doing, the ways we tried to stabilize situations that were never ours to fix. And when you look at that version of yourself through compassionate eyes, it can feel overwhelming. Because suddenly you're not just remembering events, you're recognizing the child inside of those events. You start to see the moments where you were trying to make sense of something confusing or painful without guidance. You see the places where you learned to stay quiet, where you tried to earn safety, where you tried to make other people okay, and that realization often brings a very particular kind of grief. Not just for grief for what happened, but grief for the younger version of yourself who navigated it. Grief for the things that you didn't receive, the protection that wasn't there, the emotional safety that never fully arrived. Sometimes people tell me that when they start practicing self-compassion, they suddenly feel sad in ways they didn't expect. And that sadness isn't a sign that something is wrong. It's actually a sign that something honest is happening. Because when we allow ourselves to see the truth of what we live through, compassion naturally follows. And grief often walks beside it. But this kind of grief isn't meant to overwhelm you. It's meant to reconnect you with your humanity, to remind you that the child you once were deserved care, safety, and understanding. And the compassion you offer yourself now is one way of finally giving some of that back. Another important part of self-compassion is learning to understand the difference between responsibility and blame. Those two things often get tangled together, especially for people who grew up feeling responsible for the emotional climate around them. Many children in complicated environments learn very early if something goes wrong, they should look inward first. They start asking themselves, what did I do? What could I have done differently? How do I make this better? That pattern follows us into adulthood, and eventually we start believing that if we could just understand our mistakes perfectly, we could prevent pain from ever happening again. But life doesn't work that way, and neither do relationships. Responsibility is healthy. Responsibility says, I want to understand my part in this. I want to grow. I want to do better where I can. Blame, on the other hand, says something very different. Blame says, there must be something wrong with me. I should have known. I should have fixed it. I should have prevented it. Blame takes complicated human experiences and turns them into personal failures. And the problem with blame is that it keeps us trapped in shame. Shame convinces us that the entire story belongs to us. But the truth is that most situations in life, especially relational ones, are far more complex than that. They involve multiple people, multiple histories, multiple wounds. And self-compassion allows us to acknowledge our responsibility without collapsing into shame. It allows us to say, yes, there are things I would do differently now. But the person I was then was doing the best they could with the information and safety they had at the time. And that understanding creates space for learning, space for growth, and space for healing. This is something I'm still learning myself. Self-compassion doesn't come naturally to everyone, and I'm certainly not someone who has mastered it. There are still moments where I look back at certain chapters of my life and I think about what I could have done differently. Moments where I wonder if I should have spoken up sooner, trusted my instincts more clearly, or walked away earlier. Those thoughts still show up sometimes. But grief has a way of changing the lens through which we see our lives. Losing my son rearranged everything for me. Changed the way I look at time, it changed the way I think about what really matters, and it also changed the way I speak to myself. Because when something that profound happens, you start to see how fragile and unpredictable life really is. You start to recognize how impossible it is to move through a human life without mistakes, misunderstandings, or regrets, and something softens. Not overnight, not perfectly, but gradually. Grief stripped away some of the illusions I once had about control, about perfection, about the idea that if we just make the right decisions, life will unfold safely. It showed me how human we all are, And that realization has slowly made room for more compassion, not just for other people, but for myself too. Self-compassion isn't a destination we arrive at. It's something we practice. Sometimes it begins with something very simple, just noticing the way we speak to ourselves, noticing the tone that appears in our thoughts when something goes wrong, noticing how quickly our mind jumps to criticism. Many people are surprised when they realize how harsh their internal voice has become. But that voice didn't appear out of nowhere. It often developed as a form of protection. If you criticize yourself first, maybe no one else will. If you analyze every mistake, maybe you can prevent the next one. But eventually that voice stops protecting you and it starts exhausting you. Self-compassion begins when we interrupt that pattern, when we pause and ask ourselves a different question. What would kindness sound like right now? Sometimes kindness sounds like patience. Sometimes it sounds like forgiveness or sounds like understanding. Understanding that you were learning, that you were surviving, that you were human. And over time, as you practice speaking to yourself with a little more gentleness, something begins to shift. The voice of criticism slowly becomes quieter, and the voice of compassion becomes easier to hear. Not perfectly, but enough to remind you that healing doesn't require perfection. It only requires honesty and care. Before we close today, there's one more reflection I want to share. Recently, there was a trend going around on social media where people were posting pictures of their current selves next to pictures of their younger selves. Maybe you saw it. The idea was simple. You add 2 photos, one of the adult you are now and one of the child you were, and the adult would then hug that child. When I tried it, I chose a picture of myself from a time in my childhood when things weren't easy. A time when there was a lot happening in my life that I didn't fully understand yet, and I was still smiling. And when I put those 2 images next to each other, something surprising happened. All kinds of emotions came up. Because when you look at that younger version of yourself through the eyes you have now, with everything you've learned, everything you've survived, everything you've come to understand about life, something shifts. You don't see a problem. You see a child. You see someone doing their best inside circumstances they didn't choose. You see someone trying to make sense of a world that may have felt confusing, unpredictable, or overwhelming. And what struck me most was how naturally compassion showed up. Looking at that child, it felt impossible to judge her the way I sometimes judge myself as an adult. It felt impossible to say things like, you should have handled that better, or you should have known, or you should have been stronger. Because when you look at a child, even if that child is you remember something important. Children are not responsible for surviving perfectly. They are simply trying to survive. And I know a lot of people who did that exercise had a similar reaction. They looked at their younger self and suddenly felt something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel before. Tenderness, understanding, protectiveness. And maybe that's part of what self-compassion really asks of us. To look back at our lives through the same lens we would use if we were looking at any other child navigating a complicated world. Not with judgment, but with care. Not with criticism, but with gentleness, and maybe even with gratitude for how hard that younger version of us worked to make it this far. When I think about everything we talked about this season, I realize that so many of these conversations really circle around that same idea, learning to see ourselves more clearly. Not through the lens of blame, but through the lens of understanding. This season, we talked about childhood, about complicated families, about silence as survival, about loving people who couldn't always show up the way we needed them to, and about the ways we learn to navigate relationships, the ways we learn to protect ourselves, the ways we're still learning to set boundaries and rebuild trust. And underneath all of those topics is something very human. We were all trying to figure out how to live inside the environments we were given. Sometimes we did that well. Sometimes we did it imperfectly, but almost always we did it the best way we knew how at the time. That's the arc I think about when I think about this podcast. Not a straight line, not a perfect path, but an arc, a movement, a gradual unfolding of understanding. And one of the most meaningful parts of that arc is the moment where we begin replacing judgment with compassion. Because when compassion enters the story, something shifts. We stop asking, what is wrong with me? And we begin asking, What happened to me and how did I survive it? That shift doesn't erase the past, but it changes in the way we carry it. Before we close today, there's one more group of listeners I want to speak to for a moment. If you're someone who is also a parent, whether your children are young now, grown, or even if you've lost a child, this season may have stirred up some difficult reflections for you. When we start looking honestly at our childhoods and the patterns we grew up with, it can sometimes bring up an uncomfortable question. Did I pass any of this on? Did I repeat something I didn't mean to repeat? Did I handle things differently than I wish I had? And if those thoughts have come up for you while listening to this season, I want to say something very clearly. Please have compassion for yourself too. Most people raise their children with the tools they were given, the understanding they had at the time, and the emotional resources they had access to. And many parents are quietly trying to do something incredibly difficult. They're trying to give their children something they themselves may not have fully received: more safety, more emotional awareness, more stability, more love. And that kind of work is complicated. Sometimes we get parts of it right. Sometimes we realize later that there were things we wish we would have done differently. But recognizing those patterns now is not failure, it's awareness, and awareness is where healing begins. It's also important to remember something we touched on earlier this season. Most of the patterns we inherit didn't start with our parents either. They were shaped by environments, histories, losses, and circumstances that came long before us. Which doesn't mean we excuse harm, but it does mean we can begin to see the larger picture. Generational patterns often move quietly through families until someone becomes aware enough to pause and to ask a different question. And if you're listening to this podcast, reflecting on your life and thinking about these things at all, there's a very good chance that you are already part of that shift. Not because you're perfect, but because you're willing to look. And that willingness matters more than you might realize. Before we end today, I want to invite you to take one slow breath with me. Just a gentle inhale through your nose and a slow, gentle exhale through your mouth. If you can, picture the younger version of yourself for a moment. Not the version you criticize, but the version who was simply trying to find their way. The child who was learning, adapting, surviving. And if it feels right, imagine offering that younger version of yourself a little kindness. Maybe just a quiet thought. Maybe something simple like you did the best you could because you did. Maybe even a hug. And the fact that you're here listening, reflecting, growing says more about your strength than any mistake ever could. And as we close this season of Sacred Arc, I want to leave you with this. The child you once were carried you this far. But the compassion you offer yourself now will carry you the rest of the way. This has been Sacred Arc. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you again in the space between.